Welcome back. The Memphis Safe Task Force is officially here in Memphis and not just preparing to mobilize, but we're already seeing units on the streets. About a dozen federal agencies are involved, and more than 200 local officers have now been deputized with federal powers. And I think at this point, the big question people are asking is, what does this actually mean for Memphis? Quick recap for anyone that's new here. Last week, the White House issued a memorandum announcing the creation of the Memphis Safe Task Force. And Tennessee's Governor Bill Lee confirmed that there have been months of conversations happening behind the scenes regarding this memorandum, which I find interesting because earlier this year, he was quoted as saying there were no plans for this current initiative to take place in Memphis, given that Memphis had been seeing historical lows in certain categories of crime. Mayor Paul Young, who is the actual mayor of Memphis, said he only learned the guard was coming when he saw the press conference on the TV. Yeah, at the same time we did. For context, conversations happen at the federal and state level, but not with the city itself, in order to bring these initiatives into Memphis. Now, the order frames Memphis as a city that's out of control, citing violent crime. The nuance is that Memphis Police Department's own numbers show that crime has been trending down in several categories, a few of them being property crime, which is at a 25-year low, and homicides, which are at a 6-year low. So the conclusion that I have drawn is that if there are categories of crime that have been trending low, why is Memphis being framed as a city that's unmanageable? Cue the Make America Safe Again initiative from our current administration. I am going to break down what the memorandum says, but please go read this for yourself because the vagueness of the language and the different executive orders that are cited is extremely important. The order authorizes the use of the National Guard underneath Title 32 of the U.S. Code, meaning Guard units can operate under state control but with federal pay. That's the loophole that would allow the president to mobilize forces through the governor without declaring martial law. I know some people are getting confused here because we're teeter-tottering on the edge of unconstitutional. The memo also lists what the task force is supposed to enforce, and this is where it gets blurry. Yes, it mentions violent crime, but it also names things like trespassing, graffiti, loitering, vagrancy, which is essentially homelessness, noise, unpermitted demonstrations, and other disturbances. Think about that for a second. We're talking about the National Guard being mobilized for traffic tickets, protests, or people experiencing homelessness. That is why we've seen in DC the Guard picking up trash and just kind of standing around idle. But making America safe again here, people. When you see things like unpermitted demonstrations, that could easily mean protests that don't have city paperwork. And under the Constitution, the right to assemble is protected. So this order sets up a direct clash with First Amendment rights. Now, this is the most interesting to me about this order. It's not just police, sheriffs, and the Guard, okay? A lot of people are focusing on the National Guard. The memo explicitly names a long list of non-policing federal agencies working in tandem with the leader of the task force. And if you don't know what they normally do, you won't realize how this could be redirected. This, in turn, will leave citizens confused on how all of a sudden orders are being enforced in ways that the public is just not used to seeing. So we're going to talk about the potential ways that these agencies could be used within the confines of this memorandum. The Department of Housing and Urban Development deals with public housing, Section 8, and housing programs. Tied into a crime task force, that could look like data sharing on who lives where or cracking down on public housing residents. Now, we've currently seen this with the recent immigration raids in Chicago that took place in an apartment complex with no regard to whether or not those found in the public spaces of that same complex were American citizens or not. And here in Memphis, we're already having reports of federal agents being in public spaces and asking for things like immigration status. Next, we have the Department of Health and Human Services. Now, This organization usually handles public health programs and welfare benefits. Here, within the confines of this task force, it could mean combing through social services records to identify people labeled as problems. Here, it could mean combing through social services records to identify people labeled as problems and feeding that into enforcement. And what I've seen is that problems could be anything from people with outstanding warrants to immigration enforcement. Next, we have the Social Security Administration. They process benefits, retirement and disability, and survivor payments. What exactly does that have to do with crime? Nothing. But under this order, their data could be tapped for identity checks, fraud cases, or compliance. And again, any identifying factors from this data to help them find their problem children, they're going to do. The next non-policing agency listed in this order is going to be the Department of Agriculture. Now, they oversee food programs and farming. In an enforcement context, that might connect to food stamps and who's receiving them. Another doorway to target vulnerable populations. Next up is the Department of Treasury. Treasury means IRS, money and financial tracking. Under this umbrella, it could shift into financial surveillance or tax enforcement. And again, it'll be framed as crime prevention. The Department of Labor. Labor oversees workplace laws and unemployment benefits. Pulled into a task force, that could mean auditing immigrant workers, labor violations, or employment fraud. Next up, we see the Department of Education. Education deals with schools, federal loans, and student needs. So imagine school protests or student demonstrations being tagged under this order, or federal funding leveraged against districts that don't cooperate. The possibilities are vast. Next, we have the Department of Energy. Energy regulates power and utilities. In a crime force, that could expand into surveillance over utility use, environmental protests, or even targeting sabotage narratives. We also see the United States Postal Service, and USPS is not just mail. It also has its own law enforcement arm, which are the postal inspectors. Under this task force, mail and package tracking could easily fold into surveillance. And lastly, I'll mention the Small Business Administration. SBA normally helps entrepreneurs with loans. Here, it could be business compliance, investigating small businesses for supposed ties to crime or immigration violations. And the order also adds and such other agencies as the chair of the task force determines. To translate, this list is not at all fixed. It could change tomorrow. Now we're going to talk about what this looked like in DC and LA. This is not the first time that the administration has done this. In Washington, DC, when federal forces came in, they didn't just go after violent crime. They set up traffic safety checkpoints. People were pulled over for small infractions, and some were asked about their immigration status right there on the spot. In fact, most were, according to reports of independent citizen journalists. So a traffic ticket turned into a federal stop. Julia Kayyem, a former Homeland Security official, went on PBS and warned about what she called undefined missions and scope creep. She even noted the president's language when announcing these orders and initiatives, saying that troops were told that they could do whatever. This is from the president's mouth. That kind of open-ended mission is exactly what causes constitutional problems. And in Los Angeles, it actually went further. A federal judge later ruled that Trump had broken the law by deploying the guard there, violating the Posse Comitatus Act, which bars the military from being used as domestic police. Now, that case matters for Memphis because it shows there's precedent for this kind of overreach being struck down. You just kind of have to keep track of how these orders are specifically being enforced. Another thing is, here in Shelby County, the jails are already overcrowded. It's been a topic of conversation amongst our local leaders for a while now. It's built for about 2,700 inmates, and it's been holding nearly 3,000. Around 300 of those beds are actually out of service. Reports have documented deaths, fights, and sickness outbreaks. Cases move slow. Some people wait months for a court date. So what happens if federal enforcement suddenly adds hundreds of arrests for trespassing, loitering, or graffiti? Any local politician would hopefully tell you the system can't handle it. If we're going to be sweeping people up for things like homelessness, what does that look like for somebody who does not have anything to bail themselves out? So the bigger picture is this order is not just about making Memphis safe. It's about normalizing federal power in local spaces. It's about blending agencies that don't normally have a role in law enforcement. And it's about creating conditions where protests, homelessness, or even small infractions can be handled as federal crimes. And if you zoom out, it connects to a broader pattern, including Project 2025. The policy blueprint many analysts have tied to centralizing power in the executive branch. So piece by piece, these moves shift the balance from local accountability to federal control. So this is what the order says. Go read it for yourself. And here's the takeaway. The National Guard isn't just showing up. They're bringing other agencies, vague authority, and a track record of scope creep with them. Personally, from what I've seen, the National Guard is being sent to simply distract with their tasks and gear, while the task force policing agencies do all the work. I'd especially look out for deputized local law enforcement carrying out orders. They're the ones that can enforce local law. The National Guard's oath to defend the citizens of the United States through the upholding of the Constitution prevents that, while there is no insurrection or martial law declared. As Memphis residents or as Americans watching from anywhere, the biggest thing to do right now is to stay informed. Pay attention to daily briefings from the task force that can be found in the media. Also look out for any changes within the initiatives and priorities of the task force that's been established in your area. Look out for federal checkpoints where they will undoubtedly be checking for things like immigration status, warrants, registration, and traffic violations. Keep your documentation on you. And by on you, I mean on your person, because you could be walking to the store and run into a federal raid, and you will be required to acknowledge whether or not you are an American citizen. These are just a few things that we need to start paying attention to. So talk to me in the comments. What is it that you guys are seeing out on the streets? And are you in favor of the federalization of civilian spaces in order to combat crime in your area? Or do you think that we need to leave that to local law enforcement? Let me know below.